The candle on the desk had burned low, and Edmund Cole's hands were shaking as he pressed the last page of the household accounts flat against the wood. Somewhere down the hall, boots struck the stone floor in a fast, angry rhythm, and he knew, before the door even opened, that his life was about to change forever. The door slammed back on its hinges. Duke Alaric Vane stood in the frame, his face pale with fury, a rolled paper crushed in his fist. "Explain this," the Duke said, throwing the paper onto the desk. "Explain where the harvest silver went, Cole, or I swear you will regret the day you ever touched my books." Edmund's stomach turned to ice. He knew that paper. He had written half of it himself, weeks earlier, trying to trace exactly the kind of missing money the Duke was now accusing him of stealing. But the numbers had been changed. Someone had gone into his careful records and rewritten them, turning his warning into his own confession. "Your Grace, I did not take that silver," Edmund said, keeping his voice steady, even as his pulse hammered in his throat. "I was trying to find out where it went. Someone altered these figures after I wrote them." "Enough," the Duke snapped. "I have heard every clever excuse a thief can invent. You will pack your things tonight, and you will be gone from this house by morning, or I will have you dragged out in chains in front of the whole staff." Every servant in the corridor had gathered by then, drawn by the shouting, standing in a silent half-circle with lowered eyes. Edmund saw the housekeeper's face, pale and sorry, and the young stable boy staring at him, as if he had grown horns. 10 years of loyal service, 10 years of early mornings and late nights keeping this estate from ruin, and it was ending in front of everyone in a single, humiliating breath. He did not argue further. Arguing with a furious Duke, in front of his own household, was a battle no steward could win. Instead, Edmund straightened his coat, bowed with as much dignity as his shaking body could manage, and turned to walk to his small room at the back of the house. But before he left the study, in the one moment the Duke turned away to pour himself a drink with trembling hands, Edmund's eyes fell on a slim leather ledger, tucked half-hidden behind a stack of old rent books. It was not the household ledger everyone knew. It was smaller, plainer, the kind a careful man might use to keep a private record of things he did not want others to see. Edmund had glimpsed it once before, weeks ago, when the Duke had left it open by accident on this very desk. He had seen enough of the numbers inside it that day to feel a cold unease he had never been able to shake. His hand moved before his mind fully decided. In one swift motion, he slid the little ledger under his coat, against his ribs, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain the Duke would hear it. But Alaric Vane did not turn around. He simply stood staring into his glass, muttering something about ungrateful servants and wasted trust. Edmund walked out of the study, with the stolen truth pressed against his chest, and no one, not even the Duke, realized what had just left the room with him. That night, alone in the narrow bed of his small room, Edmund opened the ledger by candlelight, his hands still trembling from the day's disgrace. Line after line, he found what he had feared. Payments to men whose names did not match any tenant or supplier on the estate. Numbers quietly moved from the harvest accounts into private transfers. A pattern stretching back more than a year, hidden beneath careful, deliberate handwriting that was unmistakably the Duke's own. It was not Edmund who had stolen from the estate, it was the Duke himself, and Edmund now held the only proof of it in the entire world. He did not sleep that night. He sat with the ledger locked inside an old traveling case, turning over the impossible choice in front of him. If he brought this proof forward now, who would believe a dismissed steward, freshly accused of theft, standing against a Duke's word? He would be laughed out of any magistrate's office, or worse, accused of forging the very evidence he carried. He needed time. He needed a place to think, and somewhere safe to keep what he had found, until the right moment came to use it. By sunrise, Edmund Cole walked out through the servants' gate with a single trunk, his reputation in ruins, and a secret hidden inside it, heavy enough to bring down a Duke. The rumors reached the neighboring estate before Edmund himself did. By the time Lady Elena Whitmore arrived at Vane Hall 3 days later, dust still clinging to the wheels of her carriage from the long ride, the entire household staff was whispering about the disgraced steward and the shameful way he had been thrown out. Elena had come to Vane Hall for reasons that had nothing to do with household gossip. Her family's estate bordered the Duke's land, and an arrangement had been made, quietly, over many months, between her father and Alaric Vane, that she would come to oversee certain matters at Vane Hall, while wedding preparations between the two families moved forward. It was not a match Elena had chosen for herself, but it was one she had accepted, believing it was the sensible path for a young woman with a family estate to protect and no brothers to inherit it. She stepped down from the carriage into a swirl of dry autumn leaves and looked up at the gray stone face of Vane Hall, feeling, for reasons she could not name, a small chill settle over her shoulders that had nothing to do with the weather. The Duke greeted her warmly enough at the entrance, all charm and practiced smiles, kissing her hand and calling her his dear future wife in front of the assembled staff. But Elena had grown up watching her own father manage tenants and accounts, and she noticed things other guests might have missed. The household seemed uneasy. The housekeeper avoided her eyes a little too carefully. A younger maid, arranging flowers in the front hall, glanced at her with something like pity before quickly looking away. "You will need someone to manage your personal accounts while you are here, my dear," the Duke said as he led her inside. "Unfortunately, my former steward proved himself unworthy of trust, so we are somewhat short-staffed at the moment. I heard something of that on the road," Elena said carefully. "A theft, I was told." "A very serious one," the Duke replied smoothly, though something flickered behind his eyes that Elena could not quite place. "But do not trouble yourself with it. I have already found a solution." That evening, over a dinner Elena barely tasted, the Duke revealed his solution with a strange, satisfied smile. "I have decided," he announced, "to send the man to you. Edmund Cole. He will serve as your personal steward while you remain here, managing your accounts and correspondence." Elena set down her fork, certain she had misheard. "The very man you dismissed for theft? You wish for him to manage my affairs?" "He is competent, whatever his faults," the Duke said, waving a hand as though the matter were of no importance. "And it amuses me, I confess, to see a man brought so low, forced to serve at the pleasure of the woman who will one day be mistress of this house. Let him understand fully what he has lost." There was something in the Duke's tone Elena did not like, a coldness dressed up as generosity, but she said nothing more on the subject that night. Whatever cruelty lay behind the gesture was the Duke's business, not hers. She needed someone to manage her accounts regardless, and if this Edmund Cole was truly a thief, she would discover it soon enough, and dismiss him herself. Edmund received the news the following morning from a messenger who found him in the small rented room, above the village tavern, where he had spent 2 sleepless nights turning his situation over and over in his mind. The letter, bearing the Duke's seal, informed him coldly that he was to return to Vane Hall at once and present himself, as personal steward, to Lady Elena Whitmore, under threat of having his dismissal reported to every noble house in the county if he refused. Edmund read the letter twice, disbelief giving way slowly to a strange, bitter understanding. The Duke was not simply humiliating him for sport, though there was certainly cruelty in it. The Duke wanted him close, wanted him watched. A man newly dismissed for theft, forced into servitude in the very house he had been thrown out of, was a man the Duke believed he could control completely. A man too disgraced to be believed by anyone if he ever spoke a dangerous truth aloud. What the Duke did not know was that his former steward already held the one thing that could undo him completely. Edmund packed his single trunk again, the ledger still hidden carefully beneath his folded clothes, and made his way back along the same dusty road he had walked only days before. This time, however, he walked with something steadier inside him than shame. He did not yet know how, or when, but he understood now that fate, or something very like it, had placed a weapon in his hands, and was now asking him to walk directly back into the house of the man he intended, one day, to expose. He arrived at Vane Hall in the late afternoon, and was shown, not to the Duke's study as before, but to a smaller sitting room, where Lady Elena Whitmore waited, with a stack of papers before her, and an expression Edmund could not immediately read. She was younger than he had expected, with sharp, attentive eyes that studied him carefully as he entered and bowed. "You are Edmund Cole," she said. It was not really a question. "I am, my lady. The Duke tells me you were dismissed for theft." "That is what the Duke believes, my lady." Edmund kept his voice level, careful not to sound either defensive or defiant. "I did not take anything from this house, but I understand why my word alone means little to you." Elena studied him a long moment, and Edmund found himself unable to look away from those steady, searching eyes. There was something in her manner entirely unlike the careless cruelty he had seen in the Duke, something that made him wonder, foolishly perhaps, whether this young woman might be different from everyone else who had already judged him guilty before hearing a single word in his defense. "I have not decided what I believe," Elena said finally, "but I need someone to manage my accounts while I remain in this house. And the Duke has placed you in that position. I will judge you by your work, Mr. Cole, not by rumors carried on the road. See that your ledgers are accurate, and we will get along well enough." It was not forgiveness. It was not even trust. But it was, Edmund realized as he left the room that evening, more fairness than he had received from anyone since the night his whole world had been turned upside down in the Duke's study. And somewhere beneath his careful, guarded composure, a small and dangerous hope began to take root, that perhaps, in this strange and uncertain arrangement, he had finally found someone who might listen when the time came to tell the truth. The days that followed settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm. Edmund rose before dawn each morning, as he always had, and made his way to the small office beside the kitchens where the household accounts were kept. He expected suspicion at every turn, whispered accusations from the other servants, cold looks from the housekeeper who had once trusted him completely. Instead, he found something almost worse, a careful, wary silence, as though everyone in the house had decided it was safer to simply pretend he had never left and never returned. Lady Elena, however, did not pretend anything. On his second morning back, she appeared in the doorway of the small office with a cup of tea in each hand, setting one down on the corner of his desk, without a word, before taking a seat across from him. "I want you to walk me through the household accounts," she said, "from the beginning. Every entry, every figure. I intend to understand this estate before I am asked to manage it as its mistress, and you are the only one who seems to know these books well enough to explain them properly." Edmund glanced up at her, surprised. Most ladies of her position would have left such matters entirely to a steward's judgment, trusting the numbers without ever examining them closely. "Are you certain you wish to spend your mornings on ledgers, my lady? It is tedious work." "I am certain," Elena said simply. "My father always told me that a woman who understands her own accounts is a woman no one can easily deceive. I intend to be that woman." There was something in the quiet firmness of her voice that struck Edmund deeply, a kind of steady intelligence he had not expected to find in this house of careless cruelty. He began walking her through the entries, column by column, and found, to his quiet astonishment, that she asked exactly the right questions. Why had this payment increased so sharply in the spring? Why did this supplier's name appear only twice a year instead of the usual 4? Why did one particular account, listed simply as estate improvements, never seem to correspond to any actual improvement anyone could point to? Edmund answered what he could honestly, and stayed carefully silent on the rest, though his silence, more than once, seemed to draw Elena's sharp attention rather than settle it. "You know something you are not telling me," she said one afternoon, nearly 2 weeks into their strange working arrangement, as autumn light slanted low through the office window. Edmund's pen stopped moving. He did not look up immediately. "There are many things I know that are not mine to tell, my lady." "That is not a denial." "No," Edmund admitted quietly. "It is not." Elena set down the ledger she had been studying, and folded her hands on the desk, watching him with an expression that was not angry, only patient, waiting. "I was told you were dismissed for theft, Mr. Cole. And yet every book you have shown me these past 2 weeks is meticulous, careful, exact to the last coin. A thief does not usually keep such perfect records of his own crimes. Perhaps a clever thief keeps perfect records precisely so no one suspects him," Edmund said, testing her, though his voice had none of the conviction the words demanded. "I do not think you are a thief, Mr. Cole," Elena said simply. "I think something happened in this house that I do not yet understand, and I think you know exactly what it is." Edmund's chest tightened. For 2 weeks he had carried the ledger's secret like a stone lodged beneath his ribs, unable to speak it aloud to anyone, unable even to trust his own judgment about when, or whether, the truth might ever be safe to share. Here, finally, was someone willing to listen. Someone whose sharp eyes had already seen through half the lie without being told a single word of it. And yet the danger of speaking too soon terrified him more than the silence ever had. "My lady," he said carefully, "if I tell you what I believe to be true, I need you to understand that speaking it aloud could place both of us in very real danger. I am not exaggerating for effect. I mean this as plainly as I know how." Something shifted in Elena's expression, a flicker of genuine alarm beneath her composure. "Then tell me plainly, Mr. Cole. and let me decide for myself what risks I am willing to accept. Edmund glanced toward the office door, making certain it was fully closed, and lowered his voice until it was barely more than a breath. I did not steal from this estate. The numbers used to accuse me were altered after I wrote them, changed by a hand I believe belonged to the Duke himself, in order to hide where the true missing money had actually gone. Elena went very still. And where did it go? Into private accounts. Payments to men whose names appear nowhere else in any record of this estate. Transfers that have continued, quietly, for well over a year. How could you possibly know all this, if the records were altered before you could examine them? Edmund hesitated only a moment longer before answering, the weight of the decision settling over him like a physical thing. Because I kept my own private record of every irregularity I found, separate from the household books, precisely because I feared something like this might happen. That record still exists, my lady. I have it still, hidden safely away, and it proves everything I have just told you. The color drained slightly from Elena's face, though her eyes did not waver from his. You are telling me you possess evidence that the Duke, the man I am promised to marry, has been stealing from his own estate. I am telling you exactly that, Edmund said quietly, and I am telling you because I believe, whatever comes of it, that you deserve to know the truth of the man you are being asked to bind your life to. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the office window, the last of the autumn light was fading into a soft gray dusk, and somewhere in the house, a door closed with a distant, hollow sound. Elena sat with her hands folded tightly together, her mind clearly racing through everything she had just been told, weighing it against every small, uneasy thing she had noticed since arriving at Vane Hall. Show me, she said finally. I will not simply take your word for something this serious, Mr. Cole, however much I may already believe you. If this proof exists, I need to see it with my own eyes. Edmund nodded slowly. He had known, from the moment he decided to speak, that this request would come, and he had already decided how he would answer it. Not tonight, and not here. The walls of this house have too many ears, and I do not yet know who among the staff might carry word of this conversation back to the Duke, whether from loyalty or fear. Give me a few days to find a safer place and a safer time, and I will bring the proof to you myself. Elena studied him a moment longer, then gave a single decisive nod. A few days, then. But Mr. Cole, understand this clearly. If what you have told me proves true, I will not simply look away and continue toward a marriage built on such a foundation. I would rather face any scandal, any ruin to my own family's prospects, than spend my life bound to a man capable of this kind of deception. There was a steel in her voice Edmund had not fully heard from her before, and it struck him with a force he had not expected, a quiet admiration rising up alongside the fear still coiled tight in his chest. Whatever came next, he understood now that he was no longer facing this danger entirely alone. Over the following days, Edmund moved through the house with a careful, deliberate calm, determined not to give the slightest sign that anything had changed. He continued his ordinary duties, balancing accounts, answering correspondence, overseeing the small daily matters of Elena's household affairs, all while quietly searching for a way to bring the hidden ledger to her, without risking discovery. He settled, finally, on the old chapel at the edge of the estate grounds, a small, half-forgotten stone building no longer used for regular services, visited now only rarely by an elderly groundskeeper who tended its modest garden. It was far enough from the main house to avoid casual observation, and private enough that a conversation held within its walls was unlikely to be overheard. He sent word to Elena through a folded note tucked inside the morning correspondence she always reviewed personally, a simple line asking her to walk to the old chapel after evening prayers, when the household would be occupied with dinner preparations and unlikely to notice her absence. Elena arrived exactly as the last light was fading from the sky, wrapped in a plain gray cloak that made her difficult to recognize at a distance, moving quickly and quietly across the darkening grounds until she reached the chapel door. Edmund was already waiting inside, a single lantern casting a small circle of warm light across the old stone floor, the ledger resting on a wooden bench beside him. "You came," he said, relief plain in his voice. "I told you I would." Elena pulled back the hood of her cloak, her breath still slightly quickened from the walk. "Show me." Edmund lifted the ledger and opened it carefully, turning it so the lantern light fell across the pages, and began walking her through what he had found. Line by line, entry by entry, He showed her the pattern he had traced over so many sleepless nights. The payments that led nowhere honest. The handwriting that matched, unmistakably, samples of the Duke's own correspondence. Elena herself had seen countless times over the past 2 weeks. Elena read in silence for a long while, her expression growing more troubled with every page, until finally she closed the ledger gently and sat back against the old wooden bench, staring at nothing in particular. "This is worse than I feared," she said quietly. "This is not simply carelessness or a single mistake made in a difficult season. This is deliberate, sustained, and carried out over a very long time." "Yes," Edmund said simply. "And if this were made known publicly," Elena continued, thinking aloud now, "it would not only ruin the Duke's reputation, it would very likely lead to formal charges. Fraud on this scale, against tenants, against investors who trusted this estate with their money, that is not a matter easily forgiven by any magistrate, however powerful the man accused." "That is precisely why I have not yet gone to anyone with it," Edmund said. "A dismissed steward, accusing the man who dismissed him, with no one of standing to support the claim, would be dismissed instantly, or worse, accused of forging the evidence himself. I needed someone the Duke could not so easily silence, someone whose word would actually be heard." Elena looked up at him sharply, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You are telling me you kept this secret for weeks, at considerable risk to yourself, waiting for the chance that I might believe you." "I am telling you," Edmund said carefully, "that I hoped, without any real certainty, that there might be one person in this house, willing to see past what I appeared to be, to what was actually true. I did not know it would be you. I only hoped it might be someone." Something passed between them in the quiet lantern light, an understanding that went beyond the danger of the ledger itself, a recognition of shared risk now binding two people, who, only weeks before, had been strangers, standing on opposite sides of a lie. Elena reached out and took the ledger gently from his hands, holding it as though its weight had suddenly become far heavier than mere paper and leather. "We will need to be very careful," she said. "If the Duke suspects for even a moment that this evidence still exists, and that I have seen it, everything changes. He has already shown he is willing to destroy an innocent man's reputation to protect himself. I do not think he would hesitate to do far worse, if he believed his freedom truly depended on it." "No," Edmund agreed quietly, the lantern light flickering across the old stone walls around them. "I do not think he would hesitate either. Which means, my lady, that from this moment forward, neither of us can afford to make a single careless mistake." Elena tucked the ledger carefully beneath her cloak, exactly as Edmund had once hidden it beneath his coat on the night his old life had ended, and together, in the deepening dark, the two of them began quietly planning how they might survive what was coming, and how, when the moment finally arrived, they might use the truth itself as the only weapon strong enough to bring down a duke. Winter came early to Vane Hall that year, sweeping down from the northern hills in cold gray sheets of rain that turned the estate roads to mud and kept most visitors away from the great house for weeks at a time. For Edmund and Elena, the isolation proved, in a strange way, useful. With fewer guests arriving and fewer eyes watching the daily business of the household, they found more opportunities to talk quietly, to compare notes, to slowly build a fuller picture of exactly how deep the Duke's deception truly ran. Elena began her own careful investigation, moving through channels Edmund could never have accessed as a dismissed steward. She wrote to her father's old solicitor under the guise of routine wedding preparations, asking innocent-sounding questions about how estate investments were typically recorded and verified. She struck up careful conversations with visiting merchants and tenants during the rare occasions they came to the house, listening closely to any mention of delayed payments or confusing account statements. Slowly, piece by piece, a clearer shape began to emerge from the shadows Edmund's ledger had first revealed. "There is a man named Harlan Weeks," Elena told Edmund one gray afternoon, as they sat together in the small office reviewing what appeared, on the surface, to be nothing more than ordinary correspondence. "I have heard his name mentioned twice now by different tenants, each time in connection with delayed or missing payments. Do you recognize it?" Edmund thought for a moment, then nodded slowly, a chill running through him. "Yes. That name appears in the private ledger 3 times, each time attached to a substantial transfer with no explanation of what service or goods it was meant to cover." "Then Harlan Weeks is either a business partner in whatever scheme the Duke is running, Elena said. Or he is being paid to help hide it. Either way, he is a thread worth pulling. Their investigation, careful as it was, did not go entirely unnoticed. The Duke, though outwardly occupied with his own affairs through the long winter months, had grown steadily more watchful since Edmund's return to the household. He had expected, when he arranged this cruel little humiliation, that Edmund would remain broken and cowed, grateful simply to have any position at all after his public disgrace. Instead, he began noticing small things that troubled him, the quiet confidence that had returned to Edmund's manner. The unusual amount of time Lady Elena now spent reviewing household accounts that, by rights, should have required only the briefest of her attention. A conversation, glimpsed once through a half-open door, that ended abruptly the moment he appeared. He said nothing at first, choosing instead to watch and wait, testing the waters carefully rather than acting on suspicion alone. One evening over dinner, he turned the conversation deliberately toward the household finances, watching Elena's reaction closely as he spoke. "I trust Cole has been keeping your accounts in good order," he said, his tone light and conversational. "Though I confess, I sometimes wonder what the two of you find to discuss for so many hours each week. Household ledgers are rarely so fascinating a subject." Elena kept her expression carefully composed, years of proper upbringing serving her well in this moment of quiet danger. "I find them fascinating enough, Your Grace. My father always insisted that a woman entering marriage should understand every detail of the estate she is about to help manage. I intend to honor that lesson thoroughly before our wedding." "How admirable," the Duke said, though something cold flickered behind his practiced smile. "And has Cole proven himself trustworthy in this arrangement? I would hate to think my generosity in placing him with you had been repaid with anything less than complete honesty." "He has been entirely professional," Elena said smoothly. "I have found no reason to doubt his work." The Duke said nothing further on the subject that evening, but Elena noticed, in the days that followed, subtle changes around the house. A footman, who had not previously been assigned to her wing, now seemed to appear with unusual frequency near her private sitting room. Letters she sent seemed, on more than one occasion, to arrive at their destination a day later than she expected, as though they had passed through additional hands before leaving the estate. She mentioned this to Edmund one evening, keeping her voice low even though they sat alone in the small office with the door firmly closed. "I believe we are being watched more closely than before. The Duke suspects something, even if he does not yet know precisely what." Edmund's jaw tightened, worry creasing his features in the lamplight. "Then we must be more careful still. Perhaps it would be wiser to pause our efforts to trace this Harlan Weeks for a time, until suspicion settles again." "No," Elena said firmly, surprising him with the sharpness of her refusal. "If we pause now, we lose whatever momentum we have built, and the Duke gains time to cover his tracks more thoroughly. We must move carefully, yes, but we cannot afford to stop." Her determination, Edmund realized, was not born of recklessness, but of a deep, principled conviction that had only grown stronger the longer she understood the full scope of what the Duke had done. It was not merely her own future she now felt responsible for protecting, but the tenants and investors who had trusted this estate with their livelihoods, people who had no knowledge that the man managing their fortunes had been quietly stealing from them for well over a year. It was during this tense, watchful period that Edmund first noticed the housekeeper, a stern but fair woman named Margaret Fenwick, watching him with an expression he could not immediately place. She had known him for all his years of loyal service before his dismissal, and had seemed, since his return, torn between old habits of trust and newer instructions to keep a careful distance from the disgraced Steward. One evening, as Edmund worked alone in the small office long after the rest of the household had retired, Margaret appeared quietly in the doorway, glancing behind her before stepping fully inside and closing the door. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, "I have known you a long time, and whatever the Duke claims happened, I never believed you capable of theft. You were always too careful, too honest with these books for that." Edmund set down his pen, surprised by the sudden warmth after weeks of cautious distance. "Thank you, Mrs. Fenwick. That means more to me than you know. I am telling you this," Margaret continued, lowering her voice further still, "because I think you should know that the Duke has been asking questions among the staff. Quiet questions, careful ones, about your conversations with Lady Elena." He asked young Peter, the footman, to report anything unusual he observes near her sitting room. Edmund's chest tightened with alarm. though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Did Peter agree to this? He agreed, out of fear more than loyalty, I think, Margaret said. The Duke is not a man easily refused, as you well know. But I wanted you warned, Mr. Cole. Whatever business it is, you and Lady Elena are conducting so carefully. I do not know what it is, and I do not wish to know. But I have served this house long enough to recognize the smell of danger when it settles over it, and it has settled thickly these past weeks. She left as quietly as she had come, and Edmund sat alone in the dim office for a long while afterward, turning her warning over in his mind. The net, it seemed, was tightening faster than he had hoped, and he understood now that whatever careful plans he and Elena had begun to build would need to move forward with far greater urgency than either of them had originally anticipated. He found Elena the following morning in the small chapel garden, where she had taken to walking each day before the household fully woke, using the quiet solitude to think through their next steps without fear of listening ears. He relayed Margaret's warning carefully, watching her face grow serious as she absorbed the implications. Then we no longer have the luxury of moving slowly, Elena said, her breath visible in the cold morning air. If the Duke has enlisted the staff to watch us, every conversation we hold inside this house carries risk. We must find another way to gather what we still need, and we must do it quickly. What do you propose? Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the frost-covered garden, her mind clearly working through possibilities. My father has an old friend, a magistrate named Mr. Alden Fairweather, who serves in the county seat some distance from here. He is a man of considerable reputation and unquestionable honesty, the kind of man whose word could not easily be dismissed even against a duke. If we could bring our evidence directly to him, quietly, before the Duke has any chance to interfere, we might finally have a path forward that does not depend entirely on secrecy inside this house. That would mean leaving Vane Hall, Edmund said slowly, which the Duke would certainly notice, and certainly question. Then we will need a reason for the journey that raises no suspicion, Elena said. Wedding preparations require visits to distant relatives, fittings, arrangements of all kinds. I can request permission to travel under exactly such a pretense, and you, as my steward, would naturally accompany me to manage the practical details of the journey. It was a risky plan, built on assumptions that might easily unravel under close examination, but Edmund could think of no better alternative, given the tightening danger around them. Over the following days, Elena carefully raised the subject of a journey with the Duke, framing it exactly as she had described, a visit to distant family before the wedding, combined with arrangements for her wedding attire that could not, she insisted, be properly managed from Vane Hall alone. The Duke, though visibly reluctant, could find no reasonable grounds to refuse a request so ordinary in its framing. Though Edmund noticed the careful, searching look he gave Elena as he granted his permission, as though trying to peer past her calm composure to whatever truth might lie beneath it. You will take proper escort, of course, the Duke said. I will not have my future wife traveling with only a steward for protection. Of course, Your Grace, Elena replied smoothly, though Edmund saw, in the brief flicker of her eyes toward him, a shared understanding of just how carefully they would need to navigate whatever escort the Duke insisted upon assigning to their journey. 2 days later, a small traveling party departed Vane Hall, under gray winter skies, Elena's carriage flanked by 2 of the Duke's own guards, ostensibly for her protection, though both Edmund and Elena understood clearly enough that their true purpose was to watch and report. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain toward the county seat, toward Mr. Fairweather and whatever justice he might be willing and able to provide, and toward a confrontation that both of them now understood was drawing steadily, inevitably closer with every mile the carriage wheels turned beneath them. The journey to the county seat took the better part of 2 days, the carriage rattling along muddy roads slicked with winter rain, stopping each night at small roadside inns, where the Duke's 2 guards, a broad-shouldered man named Garrick and a quieter, watchful younger man named Simon, took rooms adjoining Elena's own, close enough to hear any conversation carried on too loudly through thin walls. Edmund and Elena had anticipated this closeness, and had agreed before ever leaving Vane Hall to speak of nothing important within the carriage or the inns, saving all discussion of their true purpose for moments when they could be certain of privacy. It made for a long, tense journey, filled with careful small talk about wedding arrangements and distant relatives, performed as much for the benefit of listening ears as for any real need to discuss such things. On the second evening, at a modest inn some hours from the county seat, Edmund found a brief moment alone with Elena in the inn's small stable yard, where she had gone, ostensibly, to check on the horses before retiring for the night. The guards, occupied with their own dinner inside, had not thought to follow her the short distance from the inn door. "We are close now," Elena said quietly, keeping her voice low beneath the sound of the horses shifting in their stalls. "Tomorrow, we should reach Mr. Fairweather's residence by early afternoon, if the roads remain passable." "And once we arrive," Edmund said, "how do you propose we speak with him privately, with Garrick and Simon shadowing our every step?" Elena had clearly given this problem considerable thought during the long hours of travel. "I intend to request a private audience with Mr. Fairweather regarding certain delicate matters of my upcoming marriage, matters no proper lady would wish to discuss in front of guards or servants. It is not an unusual request, and I do not believe even the Duke's men would think to question it directly, whatever suspicions they might quietly carry." It was a thin excuse, Edmund knew, one that might not survive close scrutiny if either guard chose to press the matter, but it was the best plan available to them given the circumstances. He nodded slowly, trusting Elena's judgment in matters of social propriety far more than his own. "There is something else," Elena added, her voice dropping even further. "I have noticed Simon watching us with particular attention these past 2 days. More than simple duty seems to explain it. I believe he may suspect something beyond ordinary caution." Edmund felt a cold unease settle over him at this observation, though he kept his expression carefully composed. "Then we must be doubly careful tomorrow. If he reports anything unusual back to the Duke, before we have secured Mr. Fairweather's assistance, everything we have risked to reach this point could collapse before it ever bears fruit." They returned separately to the inn, careful not to be seen lingering together in the stable yard, and Edmund spent much of that night lying awake, listening to every creak of the old building, every distant sound that might signal discovery, the private ledger wrapped carefully in oiled cloth and hidden beneath the false bottom of his traveling case, exactly as he had carried it for weeks now, waiting for the moment it would finally be put to use. They reached the county seat the following afternoon as planned, the town larger and busier than either of them had expected, its streets crowded with merchants and travelers, despite the persistent gray drizzle that had followed them for much of the journey. Mr. Fairweather's residence sat on a quiet street near the center of town, a solid, respectable-looking house that spoke of a man comfortable in his position, but not given to excessive display. Elena's request for a private audience, framed exactly as she had planned, was received without apparent suspicion by the elderly servant who answered the door, and within the hour she and Edmund found themselves seated in a small book-lined study across from Mr. Alden Fairweather himself, a lean, sharp-eyed man of perhaps 60 years, whose careful, measured manner suggested a lifetime spent weighing evidence and testimony, with equal parts patience and skepticism. Garrick and Simon had been left, somewhat reluctantly, waiting in an adjoining parlor, assured by the elderly servant that matters concerning a lady's upcoming marriage were not typically discussed in the presence of male guards, however loyal their service. It was, Edmund thought with quiet relief, precisely the small mercy they had needed. "Lady Whitmore," Mr. Fairweather said once the study door had closed fully behind them, "your father spoke well of you in his letters over the years, though I confess I did not expect the pleasure of receiving you in my own home, under circumstances quite so mysterious as your note suggested. What is it you wish to discuss so privately?" Elena glanced once at Edmund, drawing strength, it seemed, from his steady presence beside her. Before turning back to the magistrate with a composure Edmund found himself admiring more with every passing day. "Mr. Fairweather, what I am about to tell you concerns serious wrongdoing on the part of Duke Alaric Vane, the man I am currently promised to marry. I have brought proof of these wrongdoings with me, and I have brought the man who first discovered them, Mr. Edmund Cole, formerly the Duke's own steward." Mr. Fairweather's sharp eyes moved to Edmund with new interest, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "I have heard something of your dismissal, Mr. Cole, from correspondence circulating among the county's households. I was given to understand you were removed for theft." "That is what the Duke wished everyone to believe," Edmund said steadily. "The truth, sir, is considerably different, and I have brought proof of it here today." He retrieved the ledger from beneath his coat, where he had kept it close throughout the journey, rather than risk it remaining unattended even for a moment. and laid it carefully on the desk before the magistrate. Mr. Fairweather opened it slowly, his expression shifting gradually from polite skepticism to something far more serious as he began working through the entries, occasionally pausing to ask a sharp, pointed question that Edmund answered as fully and honestly as he could. The examination took the better part of an hour, the magistrate reading in careful silence for long stretches, occasionally comparing entries against each other, testing the consistency of Edmund's account against the physical evidence in front of him. Finally, he closed the ledger and sat back in his chair, removing his spectacles to rub tiredly at the bridge of his nose. "This is serious evidence, if it proves genuine," he said finally. "Fraud on this scale, carried out against tenants and investors who trusted this estate with their livelihoods, is not a matter I can simply overlook, even against a man of the Duke's standing. Perhaps especially not against a man of his standing, given how much trust and how many fortunes have been placed in his hands." "Then you believe us?" Elena asked, hope evident in her voice for the first time since they had entered the study. "I believe the evidence warrants a full and formal investigation," Mr. Fairweather said carefully. "That is a different matter from simple belief, Lady Whitmore, and I must caution you both that such an investigation cannot be conducted quickly or quietly, whatever urgency you may feel. It will require verification of these records against the estate's official accounts, testimony from the individuals named within them, and considerable time before any formal action could be taken." Edmund felt a flicker of frustration at this careful, measured response, understanding intellectually the necessity of proper process, while feeling, in his gut, the mounting danger of every additional day the Duke remained unaware of what was now being set into motion against him. "Sir, with respect, we do not know how much time we have. The Duke has already grown suspicious of our activities. If he learns of this investigation before it can be properly concluded, I fear he may take drastic action to destroy the remaining evidence, or worse." Mr. Fairweather considered this for a long moment, his sharp eyes moving between the two of them with obvious calculation. "Your concern is not unreasonable, Mr. Cole. Very well. I will begin the necessary inquiries discreetly, reaching out first to certain trusted contacts among the tenants and investors named within this ledger, gathering corroborating testimony before I take any action that might alert the Duke to what is underway. This will take some weeks, at minimum, but I will move as quickly as proper diligence allows." It was not the swift resolution either of them had hoped for, but it was, Edmund understood, a genuine and serious commitment from a man whose word carried real weight in matters of law. They thanked the magistrate warmly, and Elena arranged for the ledger itself to remain safely in his possession, locked within his own private study, rather than risk carrying such critical evidence back through the countryside toward the very man it was meant to condemn. The journey back to Vane Hall felt longer than the journey away from it, weighted now, with the knowledge that they had set an irreversible process in motion, one whose outcome remained uncertain, and whose timeline stretched frustratingly ahead of them. Garrick and Simon rode alongside the carriage exactly as before, betraying no obvious sign of suspicion about the true nature of Elena's private conversation with the magistrate, though Edmund could not shake the uneasy feeling that Simon's watchful eyes lingered on them a fraction too long, a fraction too often, throughout the long return journey. They arrived back at Vane Hall on a cold, overcast afternoon, the great gray house looming ahead of them exactly as it had the day Elena first arrived weeks earlier, though everything about their circumstances had changed profoundly in the time since. The Duke greeted them at the entrance with his usual practiced warmth, inquiring after the success of their journey, with every appearance of genuine interest. "The wedding preparations progress well, I trust," he said, kissing Elena's hand, as he had done on her very first arrival. "Quite well, Your Grace," Elena replied smoothly, though Edmund, watching closely, saw the careful effort it cost her to maintain such easy composure in front of the man they had just traveled so far, and risked so much, to expose. That evening, alone once more in the small office, Edmund and Elena allowed themselves a brief, quiet moment of relief, the first genuine exhale either of them had permitted since leaving Vane Hall days earlier. "We have done what we set out to do," Elena said softly. "Whatever happens now, the truth is finally in hands capable of pursuing it properly." "Yes," Edmund agreed, though the worry had not fully left his face. "But we must remain as careful as ever, my lady. Perhaps more careful still. We have set something in motion now that cannot be stopped, and a man like the Duke, if he ever senses the walls closing in around him, may prove far more dangerous cornered than he ever was comfortable." Elena met his eyes in the lamplight, and for a moment, something passed between them that went beyond shared danger, beyond the careful partnership that had grown between them over these difficult weeks, something neither of them was yet ready to name aloud, though both, in their own quiet way, had begun to feel its steady, undeniable presence. Weeks passed at Vane Hall in a slow, watchful quiet that neither Edmund nor Elena mistook for safety. Word arrived occasionally through carefully coded letters from Mr. Fairweather, each one giving small but steady confirmation that his discreet inquiries were bearing fruit. Tenants who had once been too frightened to speak openly about missing payments began, quietly and separately, to confirm details that matched precisely what the ledger had already revealed. A merchant in a nearby town, when approached carefully by one of the magistrate's trusted associates, admitted to receiving strange, unexplained sums from an account connected to Vane Hall, sums he had never understood and had been advised, firmly, never to question. But with each small victory came new danger. The Duke, though he said nothing directly, had grown visibly more tense in the weeks since Elena and Edmund's journey to the county seat. He cancelled several planned engagements without explanation, spent long hours locked away in his study, and began, Edmund noticed with growing alarm, personally reviewing correspondence that had once been handled entirely by his own private secretary. It was Margaret Fenwick who brought the first true warning of just how close the Duke had come to the truth. She found Edmund late one evening in the small office, her usually composed face drawn tight with worry. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, closing the door firmly behind her. "The Duke summoned Simon to his study this afternoon. I do not know exactly what passed between them, but Simon left looking pale, and not an hour later, the Duke sent for a courier to carry an urgent letter to the county seat." Edmund's stomach dropped. "Do you know who the letter was addressed to?" "I could not say for certain," Margaret admitted, "but the courier mentioned, in passing, that he was bound for the residence of a magistrate. I do not know if it is the same man you and Lady Elena visited, but I thought you should know regardless." The implications settled over Edmund like a physical weight. If Simon had indeed reported something of suspicion from their journey, and the Duke had somehow learned of, or guessed at, their visit to Mr. Fairweather, there was no way to know what the Duke's letter might contain, what threats or bribes he might attempt to use against a man whose honesty had, until now, seemed entirely beyond question. He found Elena immediately, relaying Margaret's warning with barely contained urgency, and together they made the difficult decision to send an urgent letter of their own to Mr. Fairweather that very night, warning him of the possible danger and urging him to proceed with whatever caution he could manage, while also, if possible, accelerating any actions that could be safely taken before the Duke found a way to interfere. The following days passed in an agony of uncertain waiting, every knock at the door, every unexpected visitor, every change in the Duke's already strained demeanor, sending fresh waves of anxiety through both of them. Edmund found himself watching Elena more closely than perhaps was entirely appropriate for a steward observing his lady, noting the small signs of strain beneath her carefully maintained composure, the slight tightness around her eyes, the way her hands sometimes trembled faintly when she believed no one was watching. It was during this tense period that the true depth of their connection, quietly building for weeks beneath the surface of careful professional partnership, finally became impossible for either of them to ignore any longer. They had taken to meeting each evening in the small chapel garden, the one place on the entire estate where they could speak freely, without fear of listening ears, wrapped in heavy cloaks against the lingering winter chill. One such evening, as they stood together beneath the bare branches of an old oak tree, discussing yet another small, worrying development in the Duke's behavior, Elena suddenly fell silent mid-sentence, staring at Edmund with an expression he had never quite seen from her before. "What is it?" he asked, immediately concerned that something new had gone wrong. "Nothing has gone wrong," Elena said softly, though something uncertain trembled beneath her steady voice. "I was simply thinking, Mr. Cole, that in all the danger and difficulty of these past weeks, I have come to trust you more completely than I have trusted almost anyone else in my life, and I find that thought both comforting and, I confess, somewhat frightening." Edmund's breath caught in his throat. He had felt the same slow, undeniable pull for weeks now, had told himself repeatedly that such feelings were foolish, impossible, given the vast gulf between his fallen circumstances and her position as a lady promised in marriage to a duke. But standing here now, in the quiet dark of the winter garden, with her eyes searching his so openly, He found it impossible to continue pretending those feelings did not exist. "My lady," he said carefully, "I have tried very hard these past weeks to remember my proper place in this arrangement. But I confess, if I am entirely honest with you, that my feelings toward you have long since moved beyond what any steward should properly feel for the lady he serves." Elena's breath released in a soft, unsteady exhale, something like relief passing across her features. "I am glad to hear you say it, Mr. Cole, because I have felt precisely the same, and have spent no small amount of effort these past weeks trying to convince myself it was merely gratitude, or shared purpose, or simple loneliness in this cold, difficult house. But it is more than that, isn't it?" "I believe it is," Edmund said quietly. They stood together in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything unspoken between them finally acknowledged, though neither moved to close the remaining distance separating them. The impossibility of their circumstances remained exactly as real as it had been a moment before. Elena still formally promised to the Duke, Edmund still a disgraced steward with no standing to claim any place in her life beyond loyal service. But something had shifted nonetheless, a quiet understanding settling between them that whatever happened in the difficult days ahead, they would face it together, bound now by something far deeper than shared danger alone. "We cannot act on this," Elena said finally, her voice heavy with regret, even as her eyes remained steady on his. "Not now, not while I remain formally bound to the Duke, and not while everything we have worked toward hangs in such dangerous balance. If anyone were to suspect even a hint of this between us, it would give the Duke exactly the weapon he needs to discredit everything we have tried to prove." "I understand," Edmund said, though the words cost him more than he expected. "I will not let my own feelings endanger what we have built, my lady. You have my word on that." "Elena," she said softly, "when we are alone like this, please, call me Elena." It was a small thing, a simple exchange of names, but it settled between them like a promise, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever formal distance still separated them in the eyes of the world, something more honest and more real had already taken root beneath it. 3 days later, disaster nearly found them both. Edmund had gone to retrieve a letter from Mr. Fairweather that Elena had hidden, temporarily, inside a hollowed section of an old book in the estate's small library, a location they had agreed upon as safer than the office, given the Duke's increasingly close attention to Elena's usual haunts. He had just retrieved the letter and slipped it beneath his coat when the library door opened suddenly, and the Duke himself stepped inside, his sharp eyes immediately fixing on Edmund with open suspicion. "Cole," the Duke said, his voice deceptively casual, "I did not expect to find you here. This is not typically among your duties, is it, browsing the library at this hour?" Edmund's heart hammered against his ribs, the letter pressed flat and hidden beneath his coat, every instinct screaming at him to remain outwardly calm, despite the danger pressing in around him. "Lady Elena asked me to retrieve a particular volume for her reading, Your Grace. I was simply searching the shelves when you entered." "Which volume?" the Duke asked, his eyes narrowing slightly, moving slowly toward the very shelf where the hollowed book had been hidden only moments before. Edmund's mind raced desperately for an answer, and he seized, almost without thinking, on the first plausible title his eyes fell upon among the nearby shelves. "A History of the Northern Counties, Your Grace. Lady Elena expressed interest in learning more of the region before your marriage." The Duke studied him a long, uncomfortable moment, his gaze flicking briefly toward the shelf, then back to Edmund's carefully composed face, searching for some crack in the story that might betray a deeper lie. Edmund forced himself to hold the Duke's gaze steadily, drawing on every ounce of composure he had learned during his years managing this very household, until finally, with obvious reluctance, the Duke seemed to accept the explanation, though the suspicion in his eyes did not fully fade. "See that you finish your errand quickly, then," the Duke said finally, turning to leave. "I do not like finding my staff wandering where they have no clear business, Cole. Remember your place in this house." He left as abruptly as he had arrived, and Edmund remained frozen for a long moment after the door closed behind him, his heart still pounding violently, the letter still hidden safely beneath his coat. It had been, he understood with a cold, sinking certainty, the closest call they had yet faced, and he knew, without any doubt remaining, that the Duke's suspicion, however uncertain its precise shape, had grown far too dangerous to ignore any longer. He found Elena within the hour, relaying the near discovery with barely controlled urgency. and watched her face pale as the full weight of how close they had come to disaster settled over her. "We cannot continue like this," she said quietly, once he had finished. "The net is closing faster than we anticipated. We need Mr. Fairweather to act, and we need him to act soon, before the Duke's suspicion hardens into something he decides to act upon himself." Edmund nodded grimly, retrieving the letter from beneath his coat and handing it to her at last. "Then let us hope, Elena, that whatever news this letter carries brings us closer to that moment, because I do not believe we have much time left to wait for it." Elena broke the seal on the letter with trembling fingers, unfolding it carefully beneath the dim light of the small office lamp, while Edmund stood watch near the door, listening for any approaching footsteps. Mr. Fairweather's careful, precise handwriting filled the page, and as Elena read, her expression shifted slowly, from anxious uncertainty to something closer to cautious hope. "He has gathered sworn testimony from 3 separate tenants," she said quietly, "each confirming payments that match entries in the ledger exactly. He has also traced Harlan Weeks to a residence 2 towns over, and believes the man may be persuaded to testify in exchange for leniency regarding his own role in the scheme. He writes that he expects to have sufficient evidence within another fortnight to bring formal charges before the regional court." Relief flooded through Edmund, quickly followed by a fresh wave of anxiety. A fortnight is still a long time, given how close the Duke came to discovering us today. "There is more," Elena continued, her brow furrowing as she read further down the page. "He warns us that he received an unusual letter himself, several days ago, from someone claiming to represent the Duke's interests, offering what he describes only as a generous arrangement in exchange for quietly setting aside any inquiries into estate matters at Vane Hall. He says he refused the offer immediately, but warns that the Duke clearly suspects an investigation is underway, even if he does not yet know its full scope or source." The confirmation of the Duke's growing awareness settled heavily over both of them. Whatever fragile advantage of secrecy they had once enjoyed was rapidly disappearing, and Edmund understood now that the coming days would require a level of caution and courage beyond anything they had yet faced. That night, unable to sleep, Edmund found himself walking the dark, quiet corridors of Vane Hall, his mind turning over every possible danger that still lay ahead. He passed near Elena's private sitting room and paused, seeing a thin line of candlelight beneath her door, and after a moment's hesitation, knocked softly. She opened the door herself, still fully dressed despite the late hour, her own sleeplessness evident in the tired shadows beneath her eyes. "I could not sleep either," she admitted quietly, stepping back to let him inside before closing the door softly behind them. "Every sound in this house tonight seems to carry some new threat." "I understand that feeling entirely," Edmund said. They stood together in the small, candlelit room, the weight of everything unresolved between them pressing close in the quiet intimacy of the late hour. "Elena, whatever happens in the days ahead, I need you to know that I do not regret a single choice that brought us to this point, however dangerous it has become." "Nor do I," Elena said softly, moving closer to him, without quite seeming to realize she had done so. "I have spent my whole life being told what path I must walk, what marriage I must accept, what duties I must fulfill, without question. These past weeks, frightening as they have been, are the first time I have truly chosen my own course, and chosen it alongside someone I trust completely." The distance between them had narrowed to almost nothing now, and for a long moment neither of them moved, caught in the fragile, uncertain space between duty and desire, danger and hope. Finally it was Elena who closed the last small distance, reaching up to gently touch Edmund's face, and he found himself leaning into her touch without any further hesitation. "I know this is not the time," she whispered. "No," Edmund agreed softly. "It is not. But I find I no longer have the strength to pretend otherwise, whatever the cost." They shared a brief, tender kiss, gentle and searching, filled with everything neither of them had been able to say aloud through all the careful weeks of shared danger and growing trust. When they finally parted, both of them breathing unsteadily, Elena rested her forehead lightly against his, her eyes closed. "We must be patient a little longer," she said, though her voice trembled slightly with the effort of the admission. "Once this is finished, once the Duke has answered for what he has done, then perhaps we may finally speak openly of what we truly want, without fear of what it might cost us." "I will wait as long as it takes," Edmund said quietly. You are worth far more patience than I have already shown, Elena. They parted that night with a fragile new understanding settled firmly between them, a promise held carefully in reserve until the danger surrounding them had finally passed. But the peace of that quiet moment did not last long. 2 days later, everything changed with a suddenness that neither of them had fully prepared for. Edmund was summoned unexpectedly to the Duke's study in the middle of the afternoon. A summons that immediately set his nerves on edge, given how carefully he had avoided any direct interaction with the Duke in recent weeks. He arrived to find Alaric Vane standing by the window, his back turned, a single sheet of paper held loosely in one hand. "Close the door, Cole," the Duke said without turning around. Edmund did as instructed, his pulse quickening as the heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing him alone in the room with the man he had spent weeks quietly working to expose. "I received an interesting letter today," the Duke said finally, turning to face him, his expression a carefully controlled mask that did nothing to hide the cold fury simmering beneath it. "From a magistrate in the county seat, informing me, with considerable formality, that certain irregularities have been discovered in this estate's accounts, and that a formal inquiry is now underway." Edmund kept his face carefully neutral, though every muscle in his body had gone rigid with alarm. "I know nothing of such matters, Your Grace." "Do you not?" the Duke said softly, taking a slow step closer. "I find that difficult to believe, Cole, given that this same magistrate happens to be the very man Lady Elena visited so urgently on your recent journey together, under the transparent pretense of wedding preparations." The pretense had finally, fully collapsed. Edmund understood immediately that further denial would serve no purpose, that the Duke's suspicion had hardened into certain knowledge, however incomplete his understanding of the full evidence against him might remain. He said nothing, meeting the Duke's furious gaze steadily, refusing to give him the satisfaction of visible fear. "You kept something from that night I dismissed you," the Duke said, his voice rising now, the careful mask finally slipping away entirely. "Some proof, some record, that you have been using against me these past weeks, poisoning Lady Elena's mind with lies to destroy everything I have built."
"They are not lies, Your Grace,"
Edmund said quietly, his own voice steady, despite the danger crackling in the air between them. "You know precisely what they are, because you wrote every damning entry yourself." The Duke's face contorted with rage, and for a terrible moment, Edmund believed the man might strike him where he stood. Instead, Alaric Vane drew a slow, controlled breath, forcing his fury back beneath a thin veneer of icy composure. "You will regret this, Cole. Whatever fragile evidence you believe you possess, whatever foolish alliance you have built with Lady Elena, I promise you it will not save either of you from what comes next." He turned abruptly and strode toward the door, calling sharply for the household guards stationed nearby, and within moments, Edmund found himself seized roughly by 2 of the Duke's men, his arms pinned firmly despite his attempts to remain calm. "Lock him in the old gatehouse," the Duke instructed coldly. "I will decide what is to be done with him, once I have dealt with certain other matters, requiring my immediate attention." Edmund was dragged from the study, without further ceremony, his mind racing desperately, even as his body was forced along the corridor, toward the estate's old, rarely used gatehouse, at the edge of the property. Whatever careful, patient plan he and Elena had built together over these long weeks had just been shattered in a single, furious confrontation. And as the heavy gatehouse door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into cold, dim isolation, Edmund understood with sickening clarity that the true danger they had feared all along had finally, fully arrived, and that Elena, unaware of what had just happened, remained entirely exposed to whatever the Duke intended to do next. Elena learned of Edmund's imprisonment within the hour, from a frightened young maid who had witnessed the guards dragging him toward the old gatehouse and rushed immediately to find her, whispering the terrible news with wide, frightened eyes, before hurrying away again, afraid of being seen delivering such information. Panic rose sharply in Elena's chest, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly, rather than let fear overwhelm the careful judgment that had carried them safely this far. She found the Duke soon after in the main hall, his expression cold and controlled, in a way that frightened her far more than open anger would have. "Where is Edmund?" she demanded, dispensing with any pretense of calm, now that the truth had clearly already come between them. "Locked away, exactly where a man who conspires against his own Duke deserves to be," the Duke said evenly. "I know what the 2 of you have been doing, Elena. I know about the ledger. about your little journey to the magistrate, about every quiet meeting and secret letter these past weeks. Did you truly believe I would allow you to destroy everything I have built without consequence? Everything you have built on stolen fortunes and broken trust, Elena shot back, refusing to be cowed despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach. Release him immediately, or I promise you, whatever protection your standing might still provide, it will not be enough to save you from what is coming. The Duke laughed, a cold, humorless sound that sent a fresh chill through her. You still do not understand your position, my dear. That ledger, wherever it currently sits, proves nothing without corroborating testimony that can survive proper scrutiny, and I have already taken steps to ensure certain witnesses reconsider their cooperation. As for Cole, I intend to have him formally charged with theft and conspiracy against his lawful lord, charges that will see him imprisoned for a very long time, regardless of whatever fanciful evidence you believe protects him. And what of me? Elena asked, though she feared she already knew the answer forming behind the Duke's calculating eyes. You will proceed with our wedding exactly as planned, the Duke said simply, as though the matter required no further discussion. You will do so quietly, without further foolish interference in matters that do not concern you, and in exchange, I will consider showing your former steward a measure of mercy he otherwise does not deserve. Refuse, and I promise you both will suffer far more than either of you currently imagines. The threat hung heavy in the air between them, and for a terrible moment, Elena felt the full, crushing weight of how thoroughly outmatched they truly were. A disgraced steward, locked away, and threatened with ruin. A young woman, with no formal power, beyond whatever leverage her family name might still provide. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she thought of Edmund's steady courage, through every danger they had faced together, of the careful, patient work Mr. Fairweather had already invested in uncovering the truth, and she found, beneath the fear, a hard, resolute core of determination that refused to simply surrender. I will need time to consider such a serious proposal, Your Grace, she said carefully, forcing her voice into something resembling calm submission, though every instinct screamed against the deception. Marriage is not a small matter, even under such circumstances. The Duke studied her closely, clearly searching for any sign of continued defiance, but Elena held his gaze steadily, drawing on every lesson in composure her upbringing had ever taught her. Finally, seeming satisfied, he nodded slowly. You have until tomorrow evening to reach the correct decision, Elena. I would advise you to reach it wisely. He left her standing alone in the hall, and the moment he was safely out of sight, Elena hurried immediately to her private sitting room, her mind racing through every possible option available to them in the short time remaining. She needed to reach Mr. Fairweather immediately, needed to warn him of the Duke's attempt to intimidate witnesses, needed somehow to free Edmund from the gatehouse, before the Duke could carry through on whatever formal charges he intended to bring against him. She penned a desperate, urgent letter to the magistrate, explaining everything that had happened and pleading for whatever swift action he could possibly manage, then turned her attention to the more immediate and dangerous problem of Edmund's imprisonment. She could not simply march to the gatehouse and demand his release, not with the Duke's suspicion now fully awakened, and his guards certainly watching her every move. She needed help from someone within the household itself, someone she could trust completely. She found Margaret Fenwick in the kitchen that evening, and after ensuring they were alone, explained the full desperate situation as quickly and clearly as she could manage. The housekeeper listened with growing alarm, her loyalty to Edmund, quietly maintained through all his months of disgrace, finally given a clear purpose. I know the man who guards the gatehouse at night, Margaret said finally, once Elena had finished. Old Thaddeus. He has served this house even longer than I have, and I do not believe his heart is truly in whatever cruel business the Duke has ordered tonight. Let me speak with him. Perhaps there is a way. Under cover of darkness that night, Margaret approached the elderly guard stationed outside the gatehouse, appealing quietly to old loyalties and shared history within the household, while Elena waited nearby, hidden in the shadows of a nearby outbuilding, her heart pounding with every passing moment. After what felt like an agonizing eternity, Margaret returned, her expression carefully guarded. He will look away for a short time, she whispered, but only a short time, my lady, and only once, before dawn. He risks his own position gravely, by agreeing even to this much. It was enough. Elena crept quietly to the gatehouse door, as the old guard, true to his word, turned deliberately away to attend to some invented business at the far end of the courtyard, and slipped inside to find Edmund seated on the cold stone floor, his expression shifting instantly from weary resignation to startled relief at the sight of her. "Elena," he breathed, rising quickly to his feet. "You should not be here. If the Duke discovers this, everything we have—" "There is no time for that argument," Elena said firmly, already working at the simple lock securing the door with a small key Margaret had provided, taken quietly from the housekeeper's own ring of household keys. "The Duke has threatened to bring formal charges against you, and has attempted to intimidate the witnesses cooperating with Mr. Fairweather's investigation. We cannot wait for the slow, careful process we originally planned. We must move now, tonight, before he can do further damage." The lock finally gave way, and Edmund stepped free of the small stone cell, his relief at seeing Elena tempered immediately by fresh worry for what such a daring rescue might cost her if discovered. "What do you propose we do?" "We ride tonight for the county seat," Elena said, already moving with quick, decisive purpose toward the small stable at the edge of the property. "We bring Mr. Fairweather everything we know of the Duke's attempts to intimidate witnesses, and we press him to act immediately, formal process or not, before the Duke has any further opportunity to destroy what remains of the evidence against him." It was a desperate plan, born of necessity rather than careful strategy, but Edmund could see no better alternative, given how quickly their circumstances had deteriorated. Together, moving as quietly and quickly as the darkness allowed, they made their way to the stable, saddled 2 horses with hands made clumsy by urgency and fear, and rode out from Vane Hall into the cold night, leaving behind the great grey house and everything it represented, racing against time, and against a Duke who now understood, with terrible clarity, exactly how close he had come to losing everything he had built on a foundation of lies. The road to the county seat, familiar now from their earlier journey, felt entirely different, traveled at a hard gallop through the darkness, every sound behind them sending fresh jolts of fear through Elena's chest, certain at any moment they might hear the pursuing hoofbeats of the Duke's guards. But the night remained silent, save for their own horses' labored breathing, and as the first gray light of dawn began creeping over the eastern hills, they finally reached the outskirts of the county seat, exhausted but unharmed, carrying with them the last, best hope of finally bringing Duke Alaric Vane to true and lasting justice. Mr. Fairweather received them within the hour, roused from his morning routine by the urgent, disheveled arrival of Lady Elena Whitmore and her steward, both exhausted from a night spent riding hard across the winter countryside. He listened with growing gravity as they explained everything that had happened, the Duke's discovery of their activities, his imprisonment of Edmund, his open threats against them both, and his attempts to intimidate the witnesses cooperating with the investigation. "This changes matters considerably," the magistrate said, once they had finished, his earlier caution giving way now to something sharper and more urgent. "Attempted intimidation of witnesses in an active inquiry is itself a serious offense, quite apart from the original matter of fraud. I can no longer justify proceeding with the careful, gradual approach I had originally planned. This requires immediate action." Within hours, Mr. Fairweather had assembled a small party of trusted officers and gathered together the testimony and documentation his weeks of careful investigation had already produced. Enough, he judged, to justify formal charges and an immediate search of the Duke's private records at Vane Hall itself. Harlan Weeks, contacted urgently that same morning, agreed at last to provide full testimony in exchange for leniency, confirming in detail his role in helping the Duke funnel stolen funds through a network of false transactions over the past several years. "We ride for Vane Hall within the hour," Mr. Fairweather announced, his earlier measured caution now replaced with the brisk efficiency of a man who understood exactly how much was at stake in moving quickly. "I would ask both of you to accompany us, as your testimony and evidence will be essential to the proceedings, though I understand entirely if the prospect of returning so soon proves difficult." "We will come," Elena said immediately, glancing at Edmund, who nodded his own firm agreement, despite the exhaustion still evident in his features. This began at Vane Hall, and I believe it should end there as well. The journey back felt different this time, no longer a desperate flight through darkness but a determined return, flanked now by officers of the law rather than the Duke's own suspicious guards. They arrived at Vane Hall in the early afternoon, the great grey house looking exactly as it always had, entirely unaware of the reckoning now approaching its gates. The Duke was found in his study, informed by a nervous footman of the magistrate's unexpected arrival, and by the time Mr. Fairweather and his officers entered, accompanied by Elena and Edmund, Alaric Vane had already risen from his desk, his face draining of color as he took in the full weight of what their presence clearly meant. "Duke Alaric Vane," Mr. Fairweather said formally, "I am here on the authority of the regional court to conduct a full inquiry into serious allegations of fraud, theft from tenants and investors, and the attempted intimidation of witnesses in an active investigation. You will surrender your private records and accounts immediately, and you will answer these charges before the court." The Duke's composure, so carefully maintained through every previous confrontation, finally shattered completely. "This is outrageous," he snarled, his eyes darting wildly between the magistrate and Edmund, as though searching desperately for some escape from the trap, now closing firmly around him. "You would take the word of a dismissed thief and a foolish girl over that of a duke? I would take sworn testimony from multiple witnesses, corroborating financial records, and a confession already provided by your own accomplice, Harlan Weeks," Mr. Fairweather said calmly, unmoved by the Duke's fury. "The evidence against you, Your Grace, is considerable, and growing more so with each hour. I would strongly advise cooperation at this point, as continued resistance will serve only to worsen your circumstances before the court." For a long, tense moment, it seemed the Duke might attempt some final, desperate act of defiance, his hand moving briefly toward a drawer in his desk that Edmund suspected might contain a weapon, or perhaps some final attempt to destroy remaining evidence. But the officers accompanying Mr. Fairweather moved quickly to secure the room, and whatever desperate impulse had flickered across the Duke's face faded beneath the plain, inescapable reality of his situation. He was, at last, thoroughly and completely cornered. In the days that followed, the full scope of Duke Alaric Vane's crimes came to light through the formal proceedings of the regional court. Harlan Weeks's detailed testimony, combined with the private ledger Edmund had so carefully preserved and the corroborating statements of numerous tenants and investors, painted a damning picture of years of deliberate, calculated theft, carried out through a careful web of false accounts and forged records, designed specifically to shift blame onto innocent staff whenever suspicion threatened to arise. Edmund's name was formally cleared before the entire court, his original dismissal exposed as nothing more than the Duke's desperate attempt to hide his own crimes behind a convenient scapegoat. The relief of hearing those words spoken aloud, after months of carrying the weight of false accusation, brought tears to his eyes that he made no attempt to hide, standing beside Elena as the magistrate formally restored his good name before witnesses drawn from across the county. The Duke himself, stripped gradually of his standing and his freedom as the proceedings continued, faced consequences far beyond simple public disgrace. The considerable fortune he had stolen was ordered returned, as much as could be recovered, to the tenants and investors he had defrauded, and he was sentenced, in the end, to a lengthy term of imprisonment that would keep him confined for many years to come, his title and estate placed under careful oversight by the court, until proper heirs or administrators could be determined. Elena, freed at last from any obligation toward the man she had once been promised to marry, found herself facing an uncertain future in the immediate aftermath of the proceedings, her own family standing shaken somewhat by association with the scandal, even as her role in exposing it earned her considerable respect among those who understood the full truth of what had happened. But whatever uncertainty remained about her formal position in society, one thing had become entirely clear to her throughout the difficult months of danger and discovery. She knew now, beyond any doubt, exactly where her heart belonged. She found Edmund in the small chapel garden one final time, the same quiet place where so much of their careful partnership had first taken root, standing beneath the same old oak tree where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other months earlier. "It is finished," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "Truly finished, at last." "It is," Edmund agreed, turning to face her fully, his expression open now, in a way it had rarely been able to afford through all their months of careful secrecy and danger. "And for the first time in a very long while, Elena, I find myself uncertain what comes next, though I confess the uncertainty troubles me far less than it once might have." "Perhaps," Elena said, a small, hopeful smile finally breaking through the exhaustion and strain of recent weeks, "we might discover what comes next together, without any further need for secrecy or careful distance between us. Edmund reached for her hand, holding it gently in his own, the simple gesture carrying the full weight of everything they had endured together, and everything they now hoped, finally, to build. "I would like that very much, Elena, more than I know how to properly express." They stood together in the quiet garden as the last light of a long, difficult season finally began giving way to the first gentle promise of spring. Two people who had faced disgrace and danger, false accusation and desperate risk, and had emerged from it all not merely surviving, but bound together by something far stronger than the fear and uncertainty that had first brought them together. The ledger that had once threatened to ruin them both had, in the end, become the very thing that saved them, exposing the truth that justice, however slow and uncertain its arrival, could not be buried forever beneath a duke's careful lies. Spring arrived fully at Vane Hall within a matter of weeks, though the estate itself, placed under the careful oversight of court-appointed administrators, no longer felt like the cold, watchful place it had been under the duke's rule. Margaret Fenwick remained on as housekeeper, her quiet loyalty through the darkest months finally rewarded with the trust and gratitude of everyone who had witnessed her small, essential part in bringing the truth to light. Old Thaddeus, the gatehouse guard whose brief, deliberate lapse had allowed Edmund's escape, faced no punishment for his quiet act of conscience, the new administrators recognizing quickly that his loyalty had rested, all along, with what was right rather than simply with whoever held power over the household. Elena's family, though initially shaken by the scandal surrounding her broken engagement, found their standing quickly restored as the full truth of the Duke's crimes became widely known, and Elena herself emerged from the affair with a reputation for courage and integrity that opened doors far beyond what a simple, unremarkable marriage might ever have offered her. She used a portion of her own family's resources, combined with careful negotiation alongside the court-appointed administrators, to help establish a small but steady fund for the tenants and investors still working to recover fully from the years of quiet theft they had endured, earning their lasting gratitude and trust in the process. Edmund, fully restored in reputation and standing, found himself sought after by several neighboring households eager to secure the services of a steward whose honesty had been so thoroughly, publicly proven under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. But it was Elena's own family estate, in the end, where he chose to settle, taking on the management of her father's affairs with the same careful, meticulous attention he had once brought to Vane Hall, though now free of any shadow of fear or secrecy hanging over his work. Their courtship, once conducted entirely in whispered conversations and stolen moments beneath the cover of shared danger, unfolded now in the open, gentle light of ordinary life. Walks through the gardens that no longer required careful glances over their shoulders, conversations held freely at the family dinner table, rather than hidden away in locked offices after dark. Elena's father, initially cautious about his daughter's evident affection for a man who had entered her life as a disgraced steward, came slowly to understand, through careful observation of Edmund's character and the obvious depth of the bond between them, that whatever his humble circumstances, this was a man of genuine worth, precisely the kind of steady, honest partner he had always hoped his daughter might find. They were married the following autumn, exactly 1 year after the terrible night Edmund had first been thrown out of Vane Hall in disgrace, the ceremony small and simple, compared to the grand affair once planned for Elena's marriage to the Duke, but filled with a warmth and genuine joy that no amount of grand display could ever have matched. Margaret Fenwick traveled from Vane Hall to attend, embracing Edmund warmly, as though he were her own son, while Mr. Fairweather, the careful, principled magistrate whose patient investigation had ultimately made everything possible, offered a brief but heartfelt toast to justice finally achieved, and happiness, finally, deservedly found. In the years that followed, Edmund and Elena built a life together, marked by the same careful partnership and mutual respect that had first drawn them together through such dangerous circumstances. They raised a family of their own, told their children, when they were old enough to understand, the story of how their parents had first met, a tale of courage and quiet determination in the face of powerful deception, a reminder that truth, however long it might be buried, could not remain hidden forever from those brave enough to search for it. Duke Alaric Vane remained imprisoned for the full term of his sentence, his once grand title stripped of any real power or influence, his name remembered in the county thereafter, not for the wealth and standing he had once commanded, but for the scale of his deception and the ruin it had nearly brought upon innocent people who had trusted him completely. It was said, in later years, that he emerged from his long imprisonment a changed and diminished man, though few among those he had once wronged found much sympathy remaining in their hearts for whatever suffering his own choices had ultimately brought upon him. For Edmund and Elena, the memory of those difficult months never fully faded, but it settled, over time, into something closer to quiet gratitude than lingering fear. A shared history that had tested them both severely, and had, in the testing, revealed exactly the kind of people they truly were. The ledger itself, the small, unremarkable book that had once held the power to destroy them both, remained preserved among the official records of the regional court, a permanent testament to the danger of unchecked power and the quiet, persistent courage of those willing to stand against it, whatever the cost. And in the small, comfortable home they built together, Edmund and Elena often found themselves returning, in quiet moments, to that first difficult night in the old chapel by lantern light, when a disgraced steward and a young, uncertain lady had first chosen to trust each other completely, understanding even then, though neither had fully realized it at the time, that whatever else the future held, they would face it together, bound by a bond, forged not in comfort or ease, but in the fire of shared danger and unwavering hard-won truth.